Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Dean's Distinguished Lecture. We began this series last year to bring back to Ithaca our most successful and interesting alumni to speak with students over lunch. And today's distinguished lecturer, Doug Lasdon, meets both of our criteria. He's a member of Cornell's class of 1981. Doug is the executive director of the Urban Justice Center in New York City, which he founded just 3 years out of law school. When it started, it was named the Legal Action Center for the Homeless. A year after it opened its doors, it won the case of Doe versus New York, establishing the right of homeless married couples to be placed in shelters together, and it's been fighting for the rights of the most vulnerable among us ever since. When he founded the Urban Justice Center in 1984, Doug started it with a staff of one, a grant of $25,000, and it operated out of a burnt-out building in Harlem that had no heat. By the beginning of this decade, the UJC had grown to a staff of over 200, working in 12 different projects with an operating budget of $7.5 million, and recently moved into, I don't know how recently, moved into brand new digs on Rector Street.
We moved that 5 times in the
Rector Street with heat. A really nice building. Since its founding, the Urban Justice Center has handled over 8,000 cases on topics ranging from mental health to human rights to welfare. It's advocated on behalf of refugees, veterans, sex workers, street vendors, and many others. And the UJC has famously pioneered a method of legal action and education that empowers its clients to become active participants in their own advocacy. It counts among its alumni a number of notable lawyers, including Senator Cory Booker, who actually lived with Doug for a summer while he worked at the UJC, and Booker has called the UJC his professional anchor. Doug Lasdon was an undergraduate at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and as we know from a particularly prominent Wharton graduate, that means Doug is a very smart guy who has all the best words. Doug's previously served as a Wasserstein Fellow at Harvard Law School, and he's here with us this fall at Cornell as our distinguished practitioner in residence. And I'd just like to give a shout out to Beth Lyon and the Practitioner in Residence Committee for bringing Doug here to be with us. So please join me in welcoming Doug Lasdon.
Thank you, Dean. Whenever I hear that title, the Distinguished Practitioner in Residence, I'm looking around for who they're talking about because I don't feel distinguished. I do feel lucky, and I'd like to start by thanking the Dean for inviting me both to give this lecture and to be the practitioner in residence this semester. It's been delightful so far. I've really been enjoying it. Thank you also to Beth Lyon, who, as chair of the Practitioner in Residence Committee, facilitated my return and has been so helpful and kind the whole time. So thank you to Beth. I'd like to start by thanking my professor for some of the 3 professors of mine who are still here. And I was going to start with Professor Claremont, and I just told him that the only thing that makes me nervous about this is speaking in front of my old professor. Professor Claremont, who in an institution that prides itself on teaching students to think carefully, critically, and independently, has always played the ideal professor in my mind. And when he would on occasion end the class with an unanswered questions and shrug his shoulders, yes, I still recall him going, something like that, I would be reminded to be not to be overconfident in my thinking and to be open to different ideas. Professor Roberts taught me environmental law. I will always remember the story of his growing up in some sort of in a mining town. Actually, I just asked him. He grew up in a coal town right next to piles of coal, and his home windows were covered with black coal dust. And then they passed the environmental laws and rectified that. And so Professor Roberts really taught me that heart can be part of the law. I just told him I was going to thank him, and he said, yes, it can be, sort of intimating that generally not, but it can be, and that was heartening to me. Professor Barcelo taught me torts, and I spoke to him, and I think 30 some odd years ago, actually more than 36 years ago, It was the last time he taught torts. But I remember laughing in every class. And I wanted to thank Professor Barcelo for teaching me that humor can also be part of the law. As I think back about these and other professors, it is not any particular lesson they taught, but who they were as people, as teachers, that I still remember best. They were the ultimate role models and mentors who taught me as much by their actions, demeanors, and thought processes as by any pedagogical method. So I thank them, all the professors, for being who they are. Dean Peñalver, yes, I can pronounce it, told me to talk about anything, including my career. Coming back to the law school after 36 years seems like an apt time to look back and reflect on my journey since then. As the dean said, I started the Urban Justice Center in a burned-out building in Harlem back in 1984 to represent homeless people, and we were originally the Legal Action Center for the Homeless. The dean got most of the numbers right, but missed on one. Today, we do have 12 projects and a staff of over 200, and our budget is over $20 million. I wish it was $7 million. Life would be a lot easier. We've had 25 former staff go off to teach at law schools, and they include, as the dean mentioned, Senator Cory Booker, and also one of our other most prominent graduates is Chris Meade, and Chris was the general counsel to the U.S. Secretary of Treasury during the Obama administration. But it all began for me in 1981 when I graduated from Cornell. Ronald Reagan had just become president and made it his mission to eliminate the Legal Services Corporation. He did not succeed, but he did seriously wound it. And given that I was not going to work for a private law firm, I think I did say something like, I'm not going to be a tool for some corporation. I was unemployed. A friend of mine had worked at a place had done some volunteer work at a firm. So this was beyond September already. She had done some volunteer work at a place called Covenant House, runaway and homeless kids, and told me about it. And I called them up and they said, send us a resume. And I did. And it was a 2-person legal staff at Covenant House representing runaway and homeless kids. And I loved working with the kids, and I loved the other 2 people. But nobody had ever taught me about a bureaucracy. And I ran into a bureaucracy at Covenant House. About a year into the job, I researched a case on behalf of youths discharged from foster care to independent living at the age of 18. And independent living was a euphemism for the streets. And I researched a case, and I had a claim, and I'm gonna tell you about that in a little while because I never got to file it at Covenant House. I went to them and said, "Here's an interesting case. These are the kids who we see from the streets," and they said, "Well, think about it." And over the course of a year, I wrote sample complaints and sample memos. And it would have been okay for them to say, well, we're not going to bring it. And then I would have given it to somebody else. And I said, look, I did say that, if we're not going to bring it, let me give it to another office that will. There's no reason for Covenant House. They have all sorts of concerns. Maybe they didn't want to bring it, but they wouldn't do that either. And so my frustration at some point boiled over. I think that was fairly patient of me to wait a year. I realized I had to leave Covenant House or look for another place to work. In the early 1980s, in New York City and around the country, there was a new social problem that really started emerging in the late 1970s, homelessness in New York. And for the first time, I think, since the Depression, there were people sleeping on the streets of New York. I don't know if anybody here remembers, probably none of the students for sure. But there were literally people on every block or most blocks lying on the street, up against buildings, in the parks, thousands and thousands of homeless people. It was a problem that deeply touched me, and I wanted to do something about it. So I started going to monthly meetings of a nascent advocacy group called the Coalition for the Homeless. There were probably 15 to 20 people from around the city getting together and discussing what can we do. I also started volunteering for a guy named Bob Hayes. He was the one lawyer in the country representing homeless people at that time. He had brought a case establishing the right to shelter for homeless people in New York. So after work, I would go and really attach myself to Bob and learn about the media and learn about bringing cases. And I also met a priest, Father David Kirk, who I had great admiration for. There was something very authentic about him. He was living with homeless people in a shelter. He would call it a community of homeless people in Harlem at that time. And one day, in frustration over Covenant House, I said, Father David, can I come work in your community, be a staff attorney, and then I can do what I want to do? Excuse me. And Father David said, yes, if you raise the money. That was an opening. I knew nothing about raising money. It was probably a good thing I knew nothing about raising money, because I said, I'll try it. And I wrote a foundation proposal, and I sent it off to 30 foundations to be a staff attorney at Emmaus House. And one foundation called me in, a woman named Megan McLaughlin at the New York Community Trust. She liked the idea of me representing homeless people. Nobody was. She wanted to take a chance. But she said, you can't get a foundation grant and be a staff attorney at a shelter. You have to do something bigger, something broader. And it was a Friday, and she said, and I need it on my desk yesterday. And so, but I was a student for many years. I was at Cornell Law School. To write an essay, which was essentially an essay, I could do that in 2 days. And I went back and I came up with an idea to do outreach legal services, outreach legal clinics for homeless people. And I remember I got to the New York Community Trust at 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday. Before anybody was there, I found somebody to let me in. And I said, can I put this on Megan McLaughlin's desk? So she would see it there on her desk when she got there whenever she got there in the morning. Megan did give me a $25,000 grant, and I quit my job, and I went off to Emmaus House to work there. I would like to say that Megan ended up going to be the head of a group called the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agency, a very prominent group in New York, and I'll always be appreciative to her. She was the one person. My life, I think, would have been very different, and so I'm very appreciative to her. Emmaus had a community in a brownstone in Harlem, and the city had given them a burned-out building at 124th Street in Lexington in East Harlem. And Father David said, you want to work in there? And I said, sure. And, it was the exciting thing for me was finally being able to do what I wanted to do. And that was my ambition. The burned out building was really more about fun. We nailed these big wooden boards, a little smaller than those rectangles there, over the holes in the walls, and ran a cord to the building next door and had heaters and electricity. I do know that the hottest time in the year is from July 15th to August 15th. It was very hard to get anything done. And January 15th to February 15th, it was quite cold. Let me also make a point that I was not trying to start my own agency. That was just not a thought in my head. I didn't have the ambition, and frankly, I didn't have the confidence. Starting an agency was for somebody else. Getting a grant of $25,000 and representing homeless people for a year, maybe two, and then going off and getting a real job, that was what was in my mind. So there I was by myself. Although there was a colorful character, a woman named Marilyn, who came down from Maine, I think, to do security in the burned out building. I don't really know what she was doing security for. And she had a dog, so I would get there every morning and say good morning to Marilyn. And I don't think she ever left the building. I don't really know what the full story was. Emmaus probably, as I remember, brought her food. But my career has been full of characters. But when I was starting, it was important to me to do both individual cases as well as systemic reform. It's hard to do the systemic reform without the individuals, but a lot of people do it and they do it well. So I didn't know whether I should do my clinics in drop-in centers, in shelters, in supportive housing, or soup kitchens. And I really spent about 6 months trying to figure out where I would meet my clients, what their problems are, and who they were. And I think that's my phone. Excuse me. It turned out that soup kitchens actually worked the best. It's not what I would have thought, but I could get there every Tuesday at the St. James Church soup kitchen, and my clients knew where I would be. Most people would be there repeated, and so I would see them. I would see them, I would do work on their cases, and then I would see them the next week. There were some practical lessons. I remember the first, I have vivid memories of some of this stuff, and for the students, that's not a big deal, but for those of us a little older, 30 years ago or 35 years ago, to say I have a vivid memory actually means something. But I do have a vivid memory of at the St. James Church going and now, hi, my name is Doug Lasdon. I was starting out. I was doing my thing. I'm a lawyer. I'm here to help you, and I can get you welfare. And all I heard around the room was, we want welfare. We want that. No. And nobody came to see me. I went back the next week. I thought it over, and I went back the next week and introduced myself again and said, and I can get you cash assistance. And it was like, great. We'll take cash. We don't want welfare, but we'll take cash. And again, it was the age of Ronald Reagan and the very sadly, very painfully, the anti-welfare campaign and the lies about welfare queens and the misinformation and then the politicians who learned from that, Rudy Giuliani and Newt Gingrich, and then through the 90s, all the misinformation, I would say lies, is and it's very painful because we didn't have the power to overcome that. And, I knew who was on public assistance, and they weren't welfare queens, and they weren't abusing it, and they weren't cheating. So I just want anybody who's going to go out and practice public interest law, it probably applies to other people as well, but I don't know that as much. But leave your office. Go out, and whatever you're doing, I know Beth represents farm workers, get out there in the farms and talk to people there. There's in one of the books I assigned in my class, there's a quote from a researcher named Robert A. Woods, and I'm just going to read it. It's more than just a few sentences, but I think it applies to your public interest practice. And again, probably if you're representing railroads, it probably applies there too. But to secure acquaintance and knowledge so complete, detailed, and intimate meant involving oneself with people sufficiently to be taken within the reserves of family, neighborhood life, and thought. It called for accurate and minute familiarity with the local patterns of streets, houses, and institutions, as well as sustained participation in many-sided associations and interests. Science itself demanded that such an onset be characterized not only by alertness, but by sympathy. Only those who can go among men and women with affection can understand the tissue of objective causes and inward motives which bind people together. Scientific disinterestedness calls for not the separateness of the observer, but suspended judgment in the midst of action. The explorer of society must gain their facts largely as a product of humanized participation in enterprises formerly quite alien to them. And that's what I did. I was the only lawyer going to soup kitchens, talking to homeless people, and frankly, sitting down and having lunch with them. And that's where I really learned of their problems. The philosophy behind the structure of the outreach legal clinics was homeless people don't know they have rights. They don't know where to go. If they do know where to go, they don't know where to vindicate them. And even if they do make it to a legal aid office, they're unlikely to get their case accepted. So go amongst the people who don't know they have rights and spend time and learn them and meet them and have lunch and dinner and whatever it is, whatever way to get that kind of knowledge. And I like them. Homeless people are as likable, if not more likable than anybody else. They have their issues, and they're very appreciative. So systemic advocacy. When I was a student here, I remember Professor Hogan once saying, one of your challenges is to see the entire landscape of facts and find the lawsuit. And that's what I started doing. I spent so much time in soup kitchens and learned so many facts, the facts of their lives. And so where is the lawsuit? And I'd like to just talk about some of the lawsuits because they're really fun. This was a fun practice. And I have to say I had the advantage of a relatively new social problem that the city would be as cheap as possible and trying not to address it, spend as little money as possible, and no other lawyers were doing it. After a very short time, the Legal Aid Society started representing homeless families. I always represented homeless singles, and my heart has always been with those who have the least, who are least represented. And when everybody's starting a new project in my office, if nobody's doing anything, I go, great. I remember Juhu Tukral came to me one day and said, I'd like to do a legal project for sex workers. And immediately I knew nobody's doing that. They're in the street. People hate them. That's where we should be. And I said, immediately said, that's terrific. Let's figure out how to do it. And I did come back to her the next morning and say, what exactly will we be doing? But it was the bigger idea that there's a population out there that people hate, and there are lies and myths that need to be addressed. So the first case I brought was the case I researched at Covenant House. There was a sentence, I'd found a sentence in the social service law that said the city and state must, and we know what that means, supervise youths discharged from foster care at the age of 18 until they're 21 to independent living. Independent living was that category that really meant here's a token and directions to the men's shelter, literally. And the issue was, what does supervision mean? And of course, our case was made easier because the city was doing nothing, and that always opens the door to a lawsuit. So to me, supervision meant not housing in the men's shelter or the women's shelter, and support services. And to the city, of course, it meant, we'll assign a caseworker, and if they want to come back and talk to somebody, they can. During oral argument for a preliminary injunction, the city attorney was arguing, as they almost always do, that the court should defer to the expertise of the city officials. no matter what they're doing or not doing. And one of the highlights, it remains one of the highlights of my legal career, and again, a very clear memory, was when Judge Elliott Wilk, who was sitting in a typical courtroom, the New York Supreme Court, the trial court in New York, they look like courtrooms. The judge is up here, and everybody else is down there, and Judge Wilk thundered down in anger at the city attorney. Would any parent supervise their child by sending them to the men's shelter? And right there, I'm sitting down and we win. And, you maintain your decorum, but inside it was, yay! It was a great moment. And because, we took this language that who knows what it means, and we created a program. And then we got lucky because there were a couple of bureaucrats in Albany who knew about the problem. Everybody knew about the problem, and they had drafted a complete program for regulations. I don't know how long it had been, 4, 5, 7, 8 years that it had been sitting in their drawer. And now they had the political will, because of Judge Wilk's order, to get the program enacted. And in fact, we settled for that, which was much more than we could have gotten from any court decision. I also started to get an idea of the importance of the right judge. Judge Wilk had worked at the Legal Aid Society, and this is being taped, and I guess it's okay, but there was a way that you could get Judge Wilk on every one of your cases. They closed off the loophole. There's my ethics professor. I don't know if you're still teaching ethics, but if you file your case as a motion, they used to have it that the judge sitting in motion part that day would have your case, take the motion and then have it all through. So we filed all our cases with Judge Wilk. They ended up closing that loophole, and now I'm totally ethical all the time. I did, Dean Penalver referred to the married couples case. I remember at one of the soup kitchens, the husband, I think, came to me. Actually, they were together, but the husband came to talk to me. They were married, they were homeless, and in order to get shelter, the man had to go to the men's shelter and the woman to the woman's shelter. And there was a family shelter, but you were not allowed in unless you had kids. And I said, that can't be right. And I thought, well, we don't have to file a lawsuit over this. So for 6 months, I got priests and rabbis to write letters, and I tried to have meetings, and no, the city was digging in. They're not going to allow married couples into those shelters. So I found a right to family integrity in the buried, as Justice Douglas would say, I don't know if people read Justice Douglas anymore, but he was a hero of mine when I was a law student. Buried in the penumbras of the first, fourth, fifth, and I can't remember what it was, 9th or 10th Amendments, was a right to family integrity. And you could not offer a public benefit requiring, with one of the conditions being to split up a family. So we filed a case, and we litigated the preliminary injunction, and the day before, the judge had indicated he was going to rule, the city caved. And what was going on, and it was not the first time this happened, is they're digging in on their policy, and when they saw that a judge was going to make a decision making them change it, they'll settle at the last moment and avoid a big headline. And one of my other cases, I complained bitterly to the New York Times, which is, I think, the only time I ever complained to the New York Times. And we brought a similar case a little while later, and when we won that one, they put it on the front page. And I don't know if that was why, but it's a city tactic really used a lot by Mayor Koch. But anyway, I also had 2 interesting cases based on public nuisance. The first on behalf of can collectors, and the second to get public bathrooms in New York. as I mentioned, I would often eat lunch with the homeless, and I remember once sitting around a round table, and people had big bags of cans, hundreds of cans, and they were telling me about collecting them, and then they said, but we can't redeem them. The stores have limits of 0, 10, or 20 cans, and it takes us days at least, I can't remember whether they said days or weeks, to redeem them. And they would get they get a nickel for every time. And actually they were supporting the purpose of the bottle bill. And so what was really fun for me was to see the problems and then go off to the law library to see if I could find a solution. And I used to say, I don't know why I used to, but if it pisses you off, there's a claim. And I think mostly I was right. So I went to the law library, and I found the bottle bill said any store must take, I think the number was 230 cans at any one time of any type of can that they sold. Now, the case was not that easy. Because a violation was defined as a public nuisance. And the Attorney General is the only party in New York that may file a public nuisance case, except if there is a distinct population with a distinct injury different from the general population. And then maybe the Attorney General doesn't have the right motive. And so that was the legal issue. I think Judge Wilk must have moved to another part, perhaps because of us. He actually moved, I think, to matrimonial part and was the judge in the Woody Allen custody matter. But side note, we pulled Judge Beverly Cohen, which was again a good thing because her son was working at the Legal Aid Society at the time, and he joked to us that she's not allowed at the dinner table if she rules against you. It was a joke. But she did rule for us. And interestingly, the problem there was not that stores did not want homeless people in their stores. The problem was the bottle distributors, for some reason, I assume the law, ended up with the nickel. And they would have to give the nickel back to the stores when the collector would come in, give the can, the stores would give the can to the distributors, and the distributors have to give the nickel back. Well, at the time, there were somewhere between 6 and 8 billion cans sold in New York State. So I say do the math, but I'm not sure. The math, I think, worked out to be somewhere around $100 million in unredeemed nickels every year. I went back to try to find whether the 230 number was the right number, but the whole bottle bill has changed. So I don't know if they made it worse or better. So we changed the equation a little bit with the groceries. We sued the 7 largest grocery store chains in New York, and we won. And then we went back to for contempt hearings, and the real penalty there was we were working with a big firm in New York, and all these cases, by the way, are brought with big firms. The big firms in New York are very generous with their time. Their associates love it. I can even say that some of them do them for the right reasons, but it was an attorney's fees case. So we would go, and this case was with Debevoise and Plimpton, and I think they ran up $50,000 or $100,000 of attorney's fees, and that was the biggest penalty to the stores for violating the order. So now I knew about public nuisance law, and I had known for years that there's a problem that you would be unlikely to know unless you hung out with homeless people. By the way, does this go to 1 o'clock or 10 after 1, or does anybody know what time I have until? 1:15. We've got plenty of time. I'll try to leave time for questions. Public bathrooms. You wouldn't know, but once I tell you, it'll go, oh, of course, homeless people in shelters or the streets, they don't have bathrooms. They're out of the shelters during the day. Restaurants won't let them in. They might let me in. And they don't have jobs, mostly. Some of them have jobs. And so I was in Paris on vacation, and I saw, wow, they have public toilets all over. And then I learned that all over the world there are public toilets in major cities, but not in New York. So with the help of some NYU law students, we did some research that all the public toilets that the city said was available in parks and subways were not available. They were all broken or they were not serviced. So we issued a research report and filed a case based on public nuisance. And it was about the case was about the health hazard. And I thought this one would be easier, a public nuisance. If you don't have a job and if you don't have a home, you're homeless, you really do have an injury distinct from the rest of the population. The judge ruled against us, and sadly, we never got to the merits. Interestingly, this was a cost-free solution to a serious public problem. Cost-free because, I don't know if you've seen the toilets, but they have advertising that pays for them. They're self-cleaning. You have to hook them into the water and sewer system. And we solved the problem for New York. The Deco company that makes them for much around the world, they came to New York, they put into for an experiment, they did research, and 95% of the New Yorkers thought it would be a great idea. And I don't know if you could get 95 New Yorkers to agree on anything else. But they agreed that we should have public toilets, and these are terrific. That was 20, 25 years ago. We still don't have public toilets in New York. And why not? I've always thought it would be a good case study. You have a terrific solution to a serious public problem, and why can't we get it done? The short answer in my mind is there was no vested interest in making it happen other than the diffuse interest of what New Yorkers want. And there were interests that didn't want to make it happen. In the early years, there were RFPs, and one of them during the Giuliani administration, Deco won the request for proposals, and they had the best proposal. But Mayor Giuliani had a former senior advisor who was a lobbyist for one of the companies that lost, and so Giuliani scrapped the whole thing. I also had a Beggar case. The MTA banned begging. The Supreme Court had said 3 times in the previous decade that charitable solicitation was speech protected under the First Amendment. Those cases were really on behalf of private for-profit companies that would go in, help a not-for-profit, and the states had put limits on how much fees the private companies could charge, 25%, 35%. They even, the third case was something about lost my thought, excuse me. Just allowing them a full fee, they just had to make a showing. And the court just said, no, charitable solicitation is speech, and you can't regulate that. Again, on behalf of for-profit companies. So we pulled Judge Sand in the district court, and he said, I can't find a distinction between a poor person asking for help and a charity. Actually, the MTA literally said, if you're a 501c3, you can beg in the subways. And so Judge Sands, I can't find a difference, and made a factual finding of there's been no finding made or no showing made that the conduct of either one is different. So he said it's speech. They get to, and we had also, he was mindful that we had said, we will let you have time, place, and manner restrictions. No begging in the subways, by token booths, in ways that harass or annoy or block traffic. We were very specifically, we were saying, we are defending peaceful begging. Judge Al-Tamari in the Second Circuit reversed. And in the critical decision for his decision, the critical part of his decision, he found that begging when done by a poor person is conduct and therefore not protected by the speech cases, the same speech cases of charitable solicitation. Now, how did he make that decision? Precedent? Logic? The principles behind the First Amendment? No. He said, and my students, if they read the case, could back me up because we read the case in our class. No. Begging is conduct based on common sense. To his common sense, it was obvious that if a poor person asked for money, what he said was, in another overruling of a fact finding, he said all begging amounts to an assault. And he reversed. Which, before I finish telling you about the Urban Justice Center, I do want to take a minute and make a point. When I was in law school, I took legal philosophy, and I remember a question that was, how do judges decide hard cases? And so I'm here in law school, and it's been 36 years. And my answer is, I'm going to tell you in two different ways. My answer is, however they feel like it. There's a nicer way and a more useful way to say that. I can't look at Professor Claremont when I say that. Or consistent with their own conception of justice, as I think is. And let me also say, I know nothing about legal realism or any of the theory behind how judges decide cases. I just know from having brought a lot of them and having seen a lot of them, and I think most, if not all, public interest lawyers will say the same thing, as well as legislators who pick judges and justices. It's just, now it's conscious or unconscious, but it's also, the answer is important. It dictates which cases we bring and how we litigate them. If judges spend more time thinking about justice than cases, then that's where we should spend our time. That's where you have to learn to tell a story that will appeal to that justice. I think we should be studying how to develop facts, how to find them, and how to use them to tell the right story. So what do I think of the law? The law is relevant. It's not irrelevant. You have to have a hook. But as in my case with supervision or the penumbras of the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments, there's a lot of room in there. Words are ambiguous. Judges have to interpret ambiguous wording, and it's rarely clear on how to go about to do that. I remember when I was a law student, I read that Chief Justice Beggar said something about justice not being so relevant to deciding cases. It's all about looking at and applying the law. I've always thought, even then I thought, wouldn't it be nice if justice was actually part of the decision, an explicit part of the decision-making process? Back to the Urban Justice Center. I don't know what sort of controversy I've created. None, because everybody thinks that now, or people really think cases mean something. I haven't taken any classes here, so I don't know. I do think the education is important and is terrific, of learning how to think better. And I think that the pedagogical method that they did use when I was in law school, and I assume it's very similar, was valuable. And it teaches us to think better, more carefully. And that is useful as a lawyer and in the rest of your life. One thing I really enjoyed, I'm going to try to, I have a few more pages, but I do want to get to questions. I enjoyed working with recent graduates. I still do, and they come and bring great energy and ideas. And one of them, David Singleton, I don't know if Sandra Babcock is here, was a classmate of hers, but he came to work with homeless people, and I told him, get out there and learn about homeless people, and he did. And I remember him taking me to the tunnels, the Amtrak tunnels beneath New York, where mentally ill homeless people were living in darkness and no electricity and no running water, and it smelled and it was dark and shadowy, and it was one of the more horrid places if not the most horrid place I've ever been. And challenges your notion of civil liberties. And we didn't report it. We didn't bring any case, but I think if the city wanted to clean it up, I would not have protested. But he also went into the shelters. We brought a case to reduce the population in the Armory shelters from 1,000 down to 200. We were doing physical safety because people would get beat up by the security guards and by the homeless. But it turned out there was really a safety. We got a national expert in safety violation, fire safety violations, violated about 15 fire safety regulations. I'm just going to skip a little, and we won that. I want to tell you about we did reduce the populations in the Armory shelters from around 1,800 down to 200 with the lawsuit. To finish up, UJC has a unique structure. One day I was talking with, in the early days, it was the early 90s, we had been successful with our cases. We might have been 8 or 10 people at that point, maybe 12. And I was talking to a woman named Alyssa Del Tufo, who had started an organization called Sanctuary for Families for victims of domestic violence. And it got to be very big, and she didn't want to run a big organization. So she was consulting, and I went to ask her a question, and I said, how you doing? And she says, good, but I miss colleagues. And I said, come work with us. You can be the domestic violence project. You raise the money. You do whatever you want. I don't care. And that became the model of the Urban Justice Center. I went back and I told Peter Cicchino, who was on a fellowship representing LGBT youth, and I said, Peter, you're now the LGBT Youth Project. If you want to stay at the end of your fellowship, you need to raise your money, and you can do whatever you want. Really one of the more brilliant people I've ever known. I told Mark Hurwitz, who was also on a fellowship, representing mentally ill homeless people, and I said, Mark, same thing. You're now the Mental Health Project. If you want to stay, you have to raise your own money, and then you can do what you want. And Mark said, this is instructive. Mark said, I don't want to do that. And I said, well, Mark, if you want to stay, that's what you have to do. And Mark was very smart, very ambitious, and it lit a fire under him. And he scoured the laws and the foundations. And there was a federal law that created housing for homeless people. And it was long and complicated. And there was a sentence in there that allowed funds for support services. Mark applied, got a big grant, and for at least 15 years, we were the only legal service group across the country in this federal program getting money for legal services. And so I knew that, and it's been the truth, if you give people that freedom to do it the way they wanted, they will bring energy and creativity and ambition and be aggressive. And I think more than anything, that's what has caused us to grow to over 200 people, because we get people say, you mean I can do it the way I want to if I raise the money? Yeah, go do it. And you know them, they're here in the law school, people who are driven by something. And so we have the only sex worker project, I think, in the country. There may be another one somewhere. That we represent street vendors. Nobody else is doing it. Great work, by the way. We've had a project for refugees for 7 or 8 years, who this past year did file the case against President Trump's immigration ban. We have a new project for the privatization of prisons and the prison services. I could never think of these things. It's somebody comes, there's something in them. You know, for me, it was the homeless. But there's something in them that they have to do. And rather, it's sometimes a friend of mine is now running Covenant House, so I don't know what they're like now, but I assume something good. But I often say I wanted to be the anti-Covenant House. I wanted to take smart, creative, driven people and set them free and provide them the support and colleagueship that they wanted. You know, when I practiced this, it was only 30 minutes. So I think I took too much, but I think we have 10 minutes for questions. I meant to finish with, again, it's been 36 years since I've been here. I've been poverty lawyer for a long time. It's been a great career. I've done meaningful work. I've had a lot of fun. And I've met great people, and we work in community. And so it can be done, and you can enjoy it. And it's, by the way, I'm here. I'm here for another 2 weeks at least. And I'm always by email if anybody wants to talk to me. So are there any questions? Yes. Uh-oh.
So, what the judge shop being described entirely. It was universally done.
What's that?
It was universally done.
Yeah. Yes, it's
But the question is this: that what you said about justice, the goal. You started off by saying, how do you decide hard cases? The fact is that what you're saying is entirely accurate with regard to hard cases. Our hard cases, typical thing, is the practice that you've had really a typical practice. You've dealt essentially with hard cases. And so consequently the goal of what the judge has to practice probably is a bigger role. And typical law school is focusing just on hard cases, or a lot of people out there have the law and then more.
You know, fair comment, and I sort of have a good sense of, if these are all the cases, you're saying the hard, as you always had graphs and charts, the hard cases are here. So I have a good sense of that. I don't have a sense of both business and run-of-the-mill cases and medium hard or less hard cases. But I don't know if it's actually different. Yeah, so it's a fair, we don't know about, I can't comment on these. Being a careful thinker, thank you very much for your example, but yeah, and I also think the cases, it's a good pedagogical method for getting you to think carefully. So I don't advocate abolishing law schools. That's a loaded, I'm sorry. That's a loaded question, actually, because I actually don't fall on the side of the spectrum where there are people who say the clients will determine which case you bring. Which is an odd thing from someone who spent so much time in soup kitchens talking with my clients and really taking, in some sense, my instructions from my clients. But what I do is, again, I see the whole spectrum of possible cases and cases. and I bring my lawyer's expertise on what will make a better case and a winnable case. And so ultimately, I decide, but it's based on a lot of time with homeless people or whoever. And there are people who think I'm reactionary for that. But that's worked for me, and I've brought good cases, and they've been based on what my clients want. It's always on what my clients want, but I do pick and choose. And it really is, there are so many good cases that it really is more a matter, that just pisses me off. Yeah, that touches me, and so I'm going to represent the guy who has to sleep with his wife in the field. So, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's a very good and difficult question. I didn't give up on abolishing homelessness, and because I didn't get the chance to tell you, we had a case where there are all sorts of social support systems that feed into homelessness. So one way to abolish it is, okay, we had a case where you can't discharge mentally ill people from prisons right to the streets, or the foster care case. But what we really need is, when Ronald Reagan came in, he eliminated something like $20 billion or more, probably $25 billion from the federal housing budget. And so what we really need is a right to housing, and the federal government to step in and create that. I'm a lawyer, and I had to make a decision at some point to be a lawyer. And while I think that if it pisses you off, there's a claim, I could never find a claim for federal housing right. And so you can decide. I don't know how to do that. There are people who want to be organizers. They're not getting it either. There are some people who go off and write theory, and that doesn't get us there anywhere. Today we don't really have revolutionaries. So I wonder if in the 60s, when I graduated from law school, maybe I would have joined the Weather Underground. I'm lucky I didn't graduate in the 60s. It actually didn't end well for a lot of them. But I don't know if I'm answering what I think your question is, but I don't know how to do that. And I don't know how to do that certainly as a lawyer. But that's for you coming out of law school. If that's where I'm adding a lot to your question that may not be there. But for graduating, you figure that out. That's why you're asking me if I can help you. I can help. I don't know what's that? I think you asked a question and maybe I went all over the place, but yeah. Yeah. That's great. There are those limits, but I did go monthly meetings to the Coalition for the Homeless. What can we do about this? And you get the people who care about it sitting around debating it, what we can do. And interestingly, of those 15 people, they all went and started different organizations. Some of them were social workers, and they started support service, and some of them built housing. There are people who build housing. It's hard to attack it globally, so to speak. But that doesn't mean it can't be done, and that's your challenge, to find your place. Yeah. There are two major challenges. One is money, and which is sort of ironic. I don't know if irony is the right word, but you go to public interest because, well, I don't want my life to be about money. And then all of a sudden your life is about money. It's a little different. But one thing and to be aware of where you go work is the other thing besides bureaucracy that they don't teach you about in school is difficult people. Difficult people can make your life very difficult. There's never a problem with somebody raising any issue. But some people don't know how to raise it with any sort of respect. And, you go to meetings and everybody's always yelling at each other. And then someone leaves and all of a sudden the meetings are conversational. And how to deal with that is not always easy and can be very frustrating because they're often good, smart, effective people, but then you can't have conversations. So that's been a disappointment and a frustration to me for my career. And then you get people with experience and they say, the number one thing I'm looking for in a new employee is somebody who knows how to get along with others. It becomes the most important thing because it's so destructive when you have a destructive person. And, some people try to justify, well, we're going to get to a better answer through conflict. But that's hard to do on a daily basis if that's how you're living. You're going to work every day. So I think we're all right. I hope to see some of you in my office.